morning. It's Monday. Good afternoon, rather. It's Monday, the 26th of February, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today from 21st Century Wire, Patrick Henningsen. Welcome to the programme, Patrick.
Great to be with you, Mike.
And we're going to get straight on, Pat, with the beast from the east, because we are looking at potential risk to life in the UK today as the cold, chilly winds sent to us direct from Russia have reached, and it is a bit chilly, but nonetheless, we're all going to die, according to Public Health England and the Met Office. Amber warning means increased likelihood of bad weather, causing road and rail closures, interruption of power, and the potential risk to life and property. So what are we talking about here? Well, something in the region of 0 to minus 10 degrees overnight. Compare that with eastern Poland, for example, minus 24, I believe, last night. So we've got lots to be really concerned about.
Is this the first time Britain's had weather this cold before? Is that why there's an alarm?
No.
So it's been this cold before?
It has.
Every year, in fact, right?
Well, no, not every year, not in recent years. I'd probably have to go back to the 70s and 80s to get regular winters with this type of temperature. But nonetheless, beast from the east. Well, we have an exclusive on the programme today because we have a picture of the beast from the east, because here he is.
Sure, this was leaked to us by anonymous sources here. So indeed, Putin did send these winds to Britain, and here he is actually in the act of doing it.
By hacking the weather?
Essentially, yes. So they've got something akin to a giant fan, which they use to blow the wind and possibly snow across Europe to Britain. Here he is right there. We have it on tape. And now I would send powerful Russian winds to British Isles.
Yes.
So that dispels all the myths right there, Mike.
Absolutely. Now let's get straight on with the truth, because here's the Daily Mirror with a whole load more truth. Russia was behind the cyber attack during the 2018 Winter Olympic Games. Opening ceremony, claims officials. This, of course, is reported by the Washington Post. They've claimed that Russia was behind the so-called cyber attack. During the opening ceremony, they say a cyber attack caused the game's official website to crash for around 12 hours. While there was speculation that Russia was behind the attack, Russia's foreign ministry denied it. A spokesperson said, "We know that Western media are planning pseudo-investigations on the theme of Russian fingerprints in hacking attacks on information resources related to the hosting of the Winter Olympics in the Republic of Korea. Of course, no evidence will be presented to the world." This is the theme, Patrick. No evidence presented to the world on hacking, no evidence presented to the world on chemical weapons use in Syria. Just no evidence.
Yeah, lots of accusations flying around implicating Russia, among other things. So the stories just get more and more incredible. This is actually dangerous because some of these stories, Mike, where you have the overlap of the Russian collusion, Russian hacking, Russian bot narrative, and it starts overlapping with real geopolitical events where there's actually people in the field, where we have soldiers stationed, where the United States has soldiers stationed. This is the real danger. And I think a story like this was released over the weekend to very little fanfare, but if you read into this, it's kind of shocking what's being implicated here, and what the ramifications of this are, pretty dangerous, in fact. So this is by the Washington Post. They're claiming that Putin, the same, one of the people who's indicted in the recent DOJ indictment, federal indictment, has been also named in this latest. They have a intercepted phone call, we're told, from the catering mogul, who's a close ally of Putin, who's apparently not only controlling the Russian bots that are all over Twitter, getting people to like and dislike Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, but they're also controlling Russian soldiers in Syria, we're told. And they have this leak saying, move in quick, move fast to attack American troops. So they're accusing this catering mogul of also controlling Russian troops in Syria and giving them orders to attack American troops. That's the Washington Post.
So just as I understand this, are they seriously saying that troops on the ground in Syria are getting their marching orders via Twitter?
No, they're saying they're getting their marching orders via the same person, right, who is allegedly been indicted for allegedly influencing American opinion on Twitter. believe it or not. This is the Washington Post, a paper of record. This is kind of dangerous because if one of these fake news stories, and I'm thinking it's a fake news story, obviously, because there's a lot of mystery shrouded in the sort of sources and so forth. When this overlaps with real events, Mike, if something does happen and they want to blame it on Russia, that can be used as a pretext for, who knows, military escalation between the two countries, or it could cost lives at the end of the day.
Well, it's not just Russia now, it's China as well. So this is CrowdStrike, the IT company, which is now claiming that UK think tanks were hacked by Chinese-based groups last year. They said that it saw the repeated targeting of think tanks specializing in international security and defense issues beginning in April last year. Now, what evidence is there for this? Again, we're not presented with any, but they said that Chinese cyber activity increased in 2017 across the world after a downturn over the last few years. Now, this is a California-based group, and they were asked by the Democratic National Committee to investigate US election hacking early in 2016. Do they have much of a reputation in this area?
Well, this organization is fronted by a Ukrainian individual. I don't know if you can pronounce his name or not. I certainly can't today.
It's Dmitry Alperovitch. Dmitry Alperovitch.
So he's a sort of anti-Russian, anti-Putin senior fellow at the Atlantic Council, NATO-funded Atlantic Council. He's also the head of CrowdStrike, co-founder and CTO of this company. And so the FBI didn't even bother in the DNC leaks to do a forensic investigation of the DNC servers. They handed everything to the Democratic Party, handed it all to this private firm, CrowdStrike, run by this NATO-linked individual. And of course, they came up initially with the explanation that they believed that it was Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, two Russian hackers that hacked the DNC and then gave the emails to WikiLeaks, and all hell broke loose after that. So the reality was, Mike, this company had been caught planting false data in these reports, and this was mainstream news. Obviously, this didn't get a lot of airtime, and amazingly, this came out on the Voice of America, which is a quasi-government, partially government-funded media outlet. But they were forced to basically retract accusations that Russia had hacked Ukrainian surface-to-air missile launchers. I think that was a bogus story, probably tied to the MH17 official narrative that the West is pushing with regards to the MH17 story.
So now they're accusing China of the same, and of course, just a coincidence that this type of headline appears in the British press as just a week or so ago, the US suddenly switched its attention to China and suggesting that China is to be the next enemy of choice for now that Russiagate isn't succeeding in the United States.
Yeah, and not only that, look, the biggest cash cow right now in the security market is cybersecurity. Okay, so if you can get in on this gravy train, there's untold fortunes that you can make. And the press is all but willing to basically run with any innuendo or fake fabricated story of some hacking incident that comes out in the press, which is basically delivered to them by people in government. People in government are handing these stories left, right, and center to the press, and they're not questioning them. They don't question their official sources. They run with those stories. That, in turn, gins up the cybersecurity industry, which is just, in America and Britain and Europe, is just going to be printing money like it's going out of season. That's what that industry is going to be like. It's an easy way to become a multimillionaire overnight.
Okay, now in Russia, they have announced the arms defense procurement program for the next 10 years. It's been signed by Putin today, and the Deputy Prime Minister, Dmitry Rogozin, said, yes, the document was signed by the President, and that they're now going to be focusing on robotics, artificial intelligence systems, combat and reconnaissance unmanned aerial vehicles, anti-missile aircraft defense, and precision ammunition. And he also noted that this new program was drafted on the basis of the experience of use of weapons and military equipment in combat conditions in Syria. So that has definitely, Syria seems to be informing their future program, whether that's because they feel that this is the type of combat situation they're going to be experiencing for the next 10 years. But that's certainly what seems to be going on. And they also have taken note of the build-up of NATO, particularly their military potential, implementation of global strike concept by the United States, the intention to deploy weapons in outer space, and the deployment of strategic non-nuclear precision weapon systems. And so they're responding to that as well, according to Rogozin. So that seems to be the direction that they're moving in at the moment. And I would imagine there's going to be quite a bit of opportunity for cybersecurity in amongst that lot as well.
Sure, and so Syria was an incubator definitely for Russia in terms of military capabilities and technology. And so, as you rightly pointed out, Mike, situational capabilities that have been proven in combat situations. So that's the big advantage Russia has. In fact, Mike, this is why people like David Cameron are, throwing fits to try to get involved during, in any way, shape, or form, to get involved in any of these conflicts. This is why it's so important for the likes of France, the U.S., Britain, and anybody to get involved in conflicts, because they want a piece of the action so that they can go and show this is a proving ground for the products that they're selling to Saudi Arabia, to the Emirates, the UAE, and so forth. So that's the real benefit of being involved. They're not going to do anything in terms of pushing back ISIS or fighting ISIS, but it's about showing your technology. Then when you go to the arms fair at the Excel Center every September, then you've got some muscle behind your product, and you have some videos to show, and bragging rights in terms of being able to push that product.
Well, speaking of Syria, here is the UN Security Council on Saturday. Look at them, all the hands up. They're all voting yes. So on Saturday, the Security Council unanimously approved the draft resolution calling for a 30-day ceasefire in Syria. The usual language here, it's to allow for the delivery of humanitarian supplies to and medical evacuations out of besieged areas, including East Ghouta. So humanitarian supplies, that means resupplying ISIS. And medical evacuations, that means getting your injured ISIS troops out so they can be treated. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. That's definitely the advantage there, is it allows the terrorists to regroup, to rearm, and also to check the positions of the Syrian army, who's trying to basically liberate that area. So this has always been the subtext of any of these ceasefire negotiations. It's of huge benefit to the terrorist factions. Look, if they wanted to allow people to leave, residents in this area have had ability to leave. If there are, however many there are left, have been able to exit there for years now, Mike, and they've set up 5 humanitarian exit corridors around East Ghouta. So there's no excuse why people can't be evacuated. Clearly, everybody knows that there's going to be heavy fighting back and forth. So the question is, why are the rebel terrorists in East Ghouta keeping residents from leaving? Because it's to their advantage, Mike.
Human shields.
As human shields, and also to create nice propaganda films, which can then be sent off to CNN and the BBC, showing the white helmets doing whatever, digging out people from dust and all sorts of rescue films and things like that. Look, I saw there's videos posted on our Facebook page of the real Syria civil defense going into a building that's on fire and getting people out. This was hit by a mortar attack in Damascus, okay? And no running, shaking, and shouting. Literally, he had a helmet cam on, and it's actually a fireman doing his job.
Yeah.
Right, so it's totally different than the sort of theatrical Hollywood Netflix stuff that's being produced by the White Helmets, which is purely for effect.
So the 30-day ceasefire was agreed, but not terribly smoothly because, of course, the Russians were delaying things, and much to the angst of Nikki Haley and the British representative there as well. So Nikki Haley complaining bitterly, blaming the Russians for delaying the vote. Now, what did the Russians themselves have to say about this? Well, this is Russian Ambassador Vasily Nebenzia, who was saying that this resolution specifically excludes ISIS, al-Nusra, and any other terrorist group designated as a terrorist group, or anyone associated with Al-Qaeda. It took us so much time to reach agreement due to the fact that we did not support directions for immediate cessation of hostilities because, as it stood, it is not feasible to achieve this. Some external sponsors of armed factions fall short of and at times skirt their obligations. So, again, the Russians being diplomatic, not calling them terrorists directly, calling them armed factions, but absolutely, again, dropping the strong hint that their main objection is that the West is arming and supporting these groups. Bashar Jafri saying these governments should also recognise that the strategic schemes to divide Syria and to change the governing system will not succeed. And that's a pretty strong message. Nonetheless, the ceasefire was agreed, but the Western media today absolutely full of stories saying that the ceasefire is being broken by the Syrian government and their allies. And in the BBC today, we had a whole bunch of stories apparently of chemical weapons use.
As predicted
last week, absolutely.
Yes.
This is TASS here saying diplomat says Syrian chemical weapons hype aimed at undermining peace. They're saying the hype around chemical weapons in Syria and humanitarian crisis in East Ghouta is pursued by opponents of the Syrian government with the goal of disrupting peaceful settlement. Russia's permanent representative to the United Nations Office and other international organizations in Geneva said in an interview with TASS, unfortunately, we all see the attempts to undermine progress towards peaceful and political settlement by hyping up various issues. First of all, these are chemical issues which are used by Western countries to accuse the Syrian authorities and the army of using chemical weapons, and also Russia indirectly. And so it goes on. But as predicted, that the chemical weapons meme would be pushed out.
You predicted that on this show as well.
Yes.
And this was also said by a number of other officials. They knew it was coming. This should be proof positive, this chemical weapons fake story, that all the previous ones are exactly the same. These are ginned up to kill peace negotiations, whether they be in Geneva or where else, ceasefires, in order, of course, to further demonize the Syrian government and their allies, including Russia. So again, on cue, chemical weapons narratives, and who's believing it anymore? That's the question. So, but based on this one, people should reevaluate the previous ones too, because they're exactly the same.
Right. Iran, of course, involved in the Syria conflict, supporting the Syrian government. But at the Munich Security Conference, you were quite impressed by the Iranian foreign minister.
Yes, this is Javad. Sorry.
We're having trouble today.
Yeah, sorry.
Don't worry. Look, we're going to watch this short video clip, and then we'll comment on this, Patrick.
As you know, earlier this morning, we had the Prime Minister of Israel speaking here. And this question, which comes from Roderich Kiesewetter, who is a member of the German Bundestag, references the Netanyahu speech. I quote, "What must happen for Iran to accept the right of existence of Israel?" Question mark.
Well, you see, the entire speech was trying to evade the issue. What has happened in the past several days has been that the so-called invincibility has crumbled. Israel uses aggression as a policy against its neighbors. Mass reprisals against its neighbors, daily incursions into Syria, Lebanon, and other Arab countries, daily bombardment, almost routine bombardments of Syria. And once the Syrians have the guts to down one of its planes, it's as if a disaster has happened. Disaster is aggression. Disaster is the policy of violating the most basic rights of the Palestinians. Don't look for excuses. I'm focusing on our region because I believe Iran's interests are best protected in the Persian Gulf region. People should not look for excuses because of their inherent inability to resolve the problems and blame it on others. They can blame it forever on Iran, but that won't resolve their problems. It's the problem of aggression, it's the problem of occupation, it's the problem of, I'm not talking about domestic corruption and all of that, I mean, that's another problem, but it's a problem, it's a problem of trying to escape responsibility for the criminal policies that they followed for many years and trying to find a scapegoat for that, and sometimes people give them that as scapegoat.
So, Patrick, again, we have a leader from a country which is portrayed in the press as being part of the axis of evil, who is coming across as a rational commentator on what's going on around him. And you contrast that with the behavior of Benjamin Netanyahu at that same conference where he was holding up blocks of wood and
a piece of a drone that got shot down, an Iranian drone, who is a reconnaissance drone, which the Israelis say constituted an attack on Iran, which was flying over Israeli-occupied Golan Heights territory where Syria is fighting ISIS. But so that was Javad Zarif, Iranian foreign minister. He made a couple of other points in there, aside from announcing that the myth of Israeli invincibility has crumbled. And he's talking about the shoot down of the F-16 jet a couple of weeks ago, which was done by Syria. So he also made an important announcement. He said the zero-sum approach of foreign policy by the West, which has dominated post-World War II foreign policy, international relations thinking, he says this is dead. He said the area of the hegemon is dead. So we don't have any desires to be a hegemon because it's not practical. You can't maintain hegemony, and there's no point pursuing hegemony. This is what he said in this speech. And also he talked about a collective regional security approach, network rather than alliance. So he's saying that the era of alliances is also defunct, and that he's very forward-looking in terms of how we're going to deal with collective security concerns going forward, and he's specifically addressing Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Israel. Where do they fit in this new Middle East? Because they are the odd ones out. The West is trying to constantly portray, with the help of Israel and Saudi Arabia's portray Iran as the odd man out in terms of what's going on in the region and aggression and state sponsor of terror and all these other talking points, when in fact the opposite is true. The people making those accusations are actually the ones guilty of them, including the United States. So great speech. We've got it posted in full up at 21stcenturywire.com, and I encourage people to go listen to the whole 28 minutes of the speech and the Q&A, because I think it's one of the most forward looking foreign policy statements I've seen in a while, and does offer a solution where we've only seen problems coming from the West in the last few years.
Okay, now let's have a look at this. On the today, the Foreign Affairs Council of the European Commission has adopted conclusions on this is how they describe it, conclusions on the situation in Myanmar, Burma, in particular in Rakhine State, which remains very serious. So to celebrate that, they've pushed out this most obscene piece of propaganda that we're showing on screen at the moment. The EU will sanction senior Myanmar officials for human rights violations. They're saying that they're basically pushing forward a narrative which is there's no sort of scope for discussion in this narrative. It is the Burmese authorities that are causing all the problems in Rakhine. They're saying the Council condemns ongoing widespread, systematic, grave human rights violations committed by the Myanmar Burma military and security forces, including rape and killings, and reiterates its condemnation of attacks by the Rohingya Salvation Army and other militant groups. The EU also calls upon Myanmar Burma to address the issue of accountability and so on. So they're going to impose further sanctions, they say, and so on. But I just wanted to show that little piece of propaganda that they pushed out because, I'm just going to remind everybody once again that a couple of weeks ago the BBC had pushed this out on Twitter, which apparently was a drawing drawn by a Rohingya child in exile in Bangladesh. And we can see in that picture, their house on fire on the right-hand side and a burning adult, presumably a parent, on the right-hand side. On the left-hand side, we have supposedly the person who did this. And the point that we made when this was originally tweeted out was, well, that person on the left does not look like the Burmese military, Patrick.
Looks like an Islamist extremist militant.
Absolutely, absolutely. So the question is, who is doing this? Well, the EU says that it's the Burmese military, but this image implies that it's not necessarily entirely the Burmese military. I'm not saying that the Burmese military haven't committed bad things or haven't done bad things. I'm quite certain that they have. But it is too simplistic to say that it's only them at work here. And the fact of the matter is that if you're presenting, it seems to me, Patrick, if you're presenting a simplistic narrative like this, you're not therefore dealing with the problem. You're perhaps hoping that the problem is this unfair, that you're hoping that the problem is going to get worse because there's a policy agenda at work here. They want to intervene. They want to have an excuse for intervention. And so they're promoting a narrative which says one thing is true, and because it's only the Burmese military that's involved in this, then they can't get involved in any. The EU can't get involved in stopping it. So am I missing the point here? Because it seems that there could be international action takes part here, but without recognizing who's actually responsible, the right action can't happen.
Yeah, so we've had on this show Garrett O'Coleman, who has been to Myanmar and has reported back to us, and also on the Sunday Wire, that there are multiple parties involved in this violence. There are Islamist groups, armed terrorists, you might also call them as well, active in this part of the region, acting as agent provocateurs, and guilty of lots of egregious crimes against humanity as well. So, how do you separate this? How do you separate the two parties? The point here, Mike, is the EU is exerting itself as an international actor by this statement. The European Union, with its new defense alliances, yeah, and the funding and all the other operations that are coming into play now, funding streams and so forth, they would love to deploy a peacekeeping force and to show what they can do and what the future of European collective defense can do in terms of projecting European values and good governance and so forth globally. So this is a good opportunity here. We've already seen Federica Mogherini on the ground there in Bangladesh or in Rakhine State. I'm not sure exactly where, but she visited refugee camps.
Yeah, that was in Bangladesh.
In Bangladesh,
yeah,
before Christmas. So that's what it's about. So basically, if you wondered, is there going to be any difference between the EU as an international actor and, let's say, the United States or NATO? The answer is going to be no, because the way that they're pushing this monolithic sort of interpretation of events going on in Myanmar, and then using that as a pretext to put sanctions on the country, which is effectively an act of war, okay, then the answer is no. The future of EU defense globally will be exactly the same. It'll just be another friendlier face, in my opinion, of what the United States would be doing and what NATO would be doing. It'll just be more palatable, friendlier. And that might be the strategy, Mike, is that they know that the United States and NATO are damaged brands. So they need a new resurgence global defense partner in order to do things that the U.S. and NATO can't get away with. So that's my interpretation of it.
Okay, look, Pat, let's move on to the United States and school shootings. And I wanted to highlight Kentucky Governor Matt Bevin here, who was being interviewed over the weekend about the recent school shootings, of course, the one in Florida, but also there was a school shooting in Kentucky with 2 deaths. So let's just listen to this and then we can discuss it.
Again, here's what I'll say. I mean, 100 years ago and even 50 years ago, we had more guns per capita in America than we do now. It's not a gun problem. Guns in these instances have been involved, clearly. Guns have often been involved when people have lost their lives. When I was a kid, especially after Christmas, people brought their guns to school. My friends, we'd get a new shotgun, get a 22 or something, you'd come to school and show it to your friends. It was supposed to stay outside in your truck, which may or may not have been locked. But kids would bring them on the buses. Sometimes they would be in kids' lockers. Nobody even thought about shooting other people with them. So it's not a gun problem. It is a cultural problem. We have a culture that is desensitized to death, that is desensitized to the value of life, and we celebrate death through our musical lyrics. We celebrate death through video games that literally reward you with extra points for going back and finishing people off. I mean, it is horrific and it is graphic, increasingly realistic. The television shows that now are even on prime time. Movies, again, these are things that have long existed, but the degree of specificity, the graphic nature of them, the encouraging of people to participate in the form of video games, and then the belief that none of this is connected to what we're seeing, give me a break. We've removed any responsibility from the homes and from communities, from schools and from churches, from things that once were the background and the foundation of the mores of a nation. So we've removed any sense of right or wrong. And in America, at every level, from the homes that we live in to the White House and everywhere in between, we need to have a frank and honest dialogue about the cultural reasons for young people killing young people.
Is there any evidence that drawing the connection to video games and movies and this behavior?
Again, go back before any of these existed. How many children walked into schools and slaughtered other children? How much more evidence do you need?
So how much more evidence do you need? This rang true to me, Patrick, to a large degree. This is a cultural issue. We're seeing the cultural destruction in the United States and the UK and in Europe, I believe. And although it's expressing itself in a much more violent way in the United States and in other places, the United States is also receiving a lot more of this cultural, I can't even think of the word, this destructive policy is being, the US children are receiving that a lot stronger than we are in Europe. We haven't quite caught up with the US in the intensity of the bombardment that children's minds are getting.
No, I think violence in America has always been a really key component of the culture. You know, the horror film genre and all of these things, they're huge in America. They've been big for decades, okay? So Americans spend a lot of money marketing violence and trying to scare themselves, trying to frighten themselves. This is Halloween. The Halloween cultures came from America. So there's definitely something inherent in the American culture that is definitely more in line with these sort of extreme violence and so forth. So it's glorified in some cases. And you know, people like Quentin Tarantino are elevated to the highest levels of society because of his great work in his films and so forth, and the darling of Cannes and film festival and so forth. So there's definitely something American here. But you know, the governor here made some great points, Mike. That's a stunning interview, and the important points are that you know, this isn't necessarily a statistical. It's school shootings are statistically insignificant in some ways, but you know, going back, you just look at these two. Look at the difference between these two guys.
Yeah. So on the left, we've got the guy clean cut and so on, saying that it's a cultural issue, and you know, music and video games are partly responsible for this.
He's making a moral argument that we need to consider the value of human life in our culture. And he's saying that this is being belittled and being downgraded by American trash media culture, basically. Okay, so he's cut his hair. Obviously he's a politician too, and then he's being grilled by this Michael Moore character here, who you know is questioning this governor's moral stance, claiming to take the liberal moral high ground on this issue of guns. And he's been given a perfectly good explanation, Mike, in this interview here. It makes perfect sense. So, but you know, let's consider the numbers. Okay, so is statistically school shootings are insignificant in America, but in terms of media coverage, they're hugely significant. So I think the public get a distorted view of reality in the sense that just because it's on CNN and every other network 24 hours a day for 2 weeks, and there's this kind of obsession stroke fetish for this story, what is the actual significance in society? In other words, when you go out in the world, it's not significant. There's a lot of hype behind it. It's an emotive story, an emotive issue, but what they're trying to do is attach urgency to that emotion. But in terms of numbers, so if guns are dangerous for students in America, in terms of numbers, then in the last 10 years, we'll look at the numbers. In the last 10 years, 176 deaths in school shootings. What about automotive accidents? Because most American teenagers own cars now and drive to school. Well, here's some shocking numbers. And this is just from 2015, these numbers, okay? 2,333 teen deaths in the United States between the ages of 16, when you get your driving license at 16 in America, you are given the keys to the car, and 19, 2,333 deaths just in that year. These numbers are fairly consistent from year to year throughout the United States. So total number treated for injuries, look at this number. I believe this is what we're looking at. 221,313 were treated in emergency departments for injuries suffered in a motor vehicle crashes in the year 2014. Okay, so those numbers might vary from year to year. You compare that, so let's say an average, Mike, 2,000 deaths a year from automotive accidents for teens, and we contrast that with school shootings, average per year, 16 over the last 10 years. So
now, what was fascinating to me, Patrick, is that as I was looking at this earlier on, is that there's almost no mention of deaths and injuries in the media. It's all about incidents of somebody bringing a gun to school, or a so-called shooting incident. Those numbers are incredible, bearing in mind the hype.
Yeah, and by the way, we should put an asterisk next to the 300 injured. There's various degrees of injury. Those are serious injuries, 300, okay? Now, those numbers, what we have on screen here, I could not find a graph to show us those numbers, okay, because they're not impressive. What you see is school incidents, like you said, Mike, school shooting incidents, and those are all really high inflated numbers, and those are impressive because you can make high numbers out of those. So the hype on this story, they're banding about all sorts of deceptive headlines now to show that there's this massive epidemic, and then they'll backdrop that with photos of people hugging loved ones. So this is ABC News, a breakdown of 47 school shootings so far this year. So there haven't been 47 school shootings. When I read this article, these are 47 gun-related incidences around schools, and not kids' schools. They're including universities as well. Okay, so far this year. So how do you break that down? What do people normally see? Well, they see the headline, and the headline tells a story, and very few people will go, including the press, will extrapolate down to justify whatever numbers or sensational claims they're making in the headlines. We're not saying there's not gun violence in America. What we're saying is, what are the major threats to teenagers and young people? And it seems to me that school shootings isn't the highest on the list. So, and here's some other numbers that we should look at to put this in perspective. I know you want to make a comment on this. How did you interpret this graph, Mike?
Well, the point here is, this comes back to the cultural point that Matt Bevan was making, because the United States apparently has this huge amount of gun ownership. Other countries also have a pretty high level of gun ownership. Firearms per 100 residents, the US is out in front, that's for sure. But we don't see a proportionate level of violence in, for example, Switzerland, Finland, Cyprus.
Sure.
So there's something else going on in the United States, is my point.
Yeah, this itself is a deceptive graph, because they're just talking about number of guns divided by number of citizens, let's say. But so a lot of Americans are avid firearm collectors, obviously, and people in the outdoors, the hunting and so forth. The enthusiasts will have multiple firearms. So I don't know if that's the same in Finland and Switzerland and Cyprus, but I'd say the per capita gun ownership in Switzerland, I would say would I be wrong to say it's as high or higher than the United States per capita in Switzerland? Probably.
Yeah.
So do they have school shootings in Switzerland? Do they have gun violence and mass shootings in Switzerland? They have possibly the highest per capita gun ownership, one of them in the world, legal gun ownership. We're not talking about South Africa and other countries with very high crime rates. So why are there no mass shootings in Switzerland? Is it to do with the guns, or is it to do with the culture and the people? So that's a good question that people should be asking.
Matt Bevan making the point that this needs to be a broad conversation, not limited to one aspect of it, but he also, I do recommend that people go and watch the full interview. It's on the Kentucky governor's website. Do go and have a look at it because he covers other things. And he discusses the use of psychotropic drugs and mental health and so on.
That's a big factor that you need to put in this. It's a big variable.
Absolutely. So do go and look at the whole thing. But the other point here is, Patrick, you're suggesting that this is a global agenda at work here, a global policy?
Well, you could look at it that way. I mean, this is the document that a lot of people will refer to, which is the UN Small Arms Treaty, which was signed by 115 countries in 2013. And so the gun lobby in America and supporters and people like Bob Corker and so forth came out and sort of decried this as a threat to the Second Amendment. If you really read that document, actually it doesn't. The irony of that document, Mike, is interesting. So it reaffirms the sovereignty of each individual nation, so it's to regulate its own gun and firearm ownership regimes within those countries, okay? But really what that treaty was about was closing loopholes internationally in terms of the import and export of small arms. So it's really about cracking down on small arms trafficking. The irony of that under the Obama administration, okay, they want to crack down on small arms trafficking by unauthorized persons, buyers and sellers, okay? But at the same time, the Obama government was trafficking weapons onto the black market in Mexico along the border region in Operation Fast and Furious, flooding the black market and the criminal operations with arms from the United States government, paid for by the U.S. taxpayer, and at the same time has been flooding Syria with illicit weapons, everything from small arms to rocket-propelled grenade and missile launchers. Okay, and we've covered that in depth on this show. So while the U.S., while Obama administration, John Kerry signed that treaty in 2013, the authorized trafficking of weapons is perfectly fine, so long as it's done by the U.S. government. Okay, so that's the hypocrisy. You could call it the irony or the hypocrisy of that UN treaty. So I don't think that treaty in itself constitutes a conspiracy to grab guns globally, but what I do think it does is it has worked as a kind of shield against state arms trafficking, which the United States is hugely guilty of, as are many other EU countries and NATO member states.
And we'll end with this one, Patrick, because this seems to be taking the debate to a new low.
Well, so this is Thom Hartmann. This is actually was published in January. Okay, so this is on Truthout, which is does a lot of good stuff in terms of anti-war. But so Thom Hartmann, who is a diehard liberal progressive to the max, is basically saying the Second Amendment was ratified to preserve slavery in the South. So this is the argument that this was circulating on social media this morning, and so the argument is that guns are tied to racism. Okay, so you'll see this coming out too more often. So they're saying that the only reason they ratified the Second Amendment was to preserve armed slave patrols in the southern states, of course, ignoring all the other states and the reality across the country at that time. This is classic cherry picking of history in order to advance political agenda. Today, we unfortunately see a lot of this revisionist history out of context. But so that's what you can expect on this issue. This is going to be, the guns will be a hot button issue for the midterm elections in the United States. So, it would be very convenient to have another mass shooting probably in August or September, possibly, right before people go to polls. Obviously, this is the voter registration deadline right around now in some states for primaries to get in registered. So I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but that would definitely help that agenda go forward. So let's hope it doesn't happen. But that's one of the Democrats' hot issues right now in America is the gun issue. So yeah. So.
Okay, well, look, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're completely out of time. Thank you very much for joining us today, Patrick. Thank you for joining us today. We will be back at the same time tomorrow, 1 p.m., and we'll see you then. Thank you. Bye-bye.